Hey everyone, hope you're all doing great. In the last couple of videos, we have been exploring functions in Python, how to define them, call them, and work with different types of parameters. Today, we are diving into yet another topic that's closely linked to functions, the scope of variables. So let's get started. I have a function here, and inside this function, I've declared this variable message. Now, if I try to access this variable from inside the function, of course, I can do that. It is able to access message, and that's why it's printing it on the screen. Hello world. But what if I try to access this message variable from outside the function where it is declared? In that case, I get a name error. I'm not able to access it. Python doesn't recognize that there is a variable with such name as message. So that means the message variable here is only available inside the function, not outside the function. So this message variable has a local scope and we call it local variable. So the variables that we define inside a function have a local scope. They are only available or accessible from inside the function. They cannot be accessed from outside of that function. Then we have global variables, the variables that we define outside of a function. So let's go ahead and create a variable text, assigning it some value. I'm writing a function to display this text variable. Let's call this display function. And I'm also trying to access the text variable here. So let's run it. So you see, first thing that will happen is we are calling the display function. So the display function gets called and it is able to access the text variable from inside the function. That is why the text variable value is getting printed here. And then we are printing the text here, the text variable from outside of our function. And this also successfully gets printed. That means that this text variable is accessible from inside the function and outside the function both. So the variables that we define outside the function have global scope. They're accessible both inside the function and outside the function. They can be accessed anywhere in the code. So the text variable here has global scope, while the message variable in this case has local scope. It cannot be accessed outside this function greet. Now let's take one more example. Let's say I have a number 10. This is a global variable, of course. Why? Because we are defining it outside the function. Now I'll have a function here which just print this number. So let's just call it display num. And it prints num. If I call this function, it will go ahead and print 10. But what will happen when I say num is equal to 20? And let me go ahead and print num from here. Inside the function, we are printing num. And what I'll do is I'm calling this function and then printing the num from outside here as well. So what do you think will get printed here? Pause the video for a second and think about it. So num is a global variable here. I'm assigning it the value 20 from inside the function, printing the num value from inside the function. What will get printed here and what will get printed for this print statement? So inside the function, it is giving us 20 and outside the function, we are getting 10. So what's going on here? I thought num was a global variable. And if it's a global variable, I'm reassigning the value 20 to num. So here 20 should get printed. But here also, the num has been reassigned the value 20. So I should get 20. But that's not what's happening here. So what's going on? So when we assign a value to a variable like we are doing here, Python treats this num variable as a local variable. So this num is a global variable while this num here is a local variable. Because we are assigning it a value, so Python treats this num as local variable. So because num is a local variable, whatever changes we make in this num variable will not reflect back to the global variable num. Let's look at one more example. Let's say I'm trying to update the value of the num. So I do something like num is equal to num plus 1. Now, what do you think will happen? And I'll just copy this as well. Will this code work? You might think that it will work, but it will not. It will give you an error. What does the error says? We are getting the unbound local error. It is saying cannot access local variable num where it is not associated with a value. So it's talking about the local variable num here, and it is saying that this local variable num has not been initialized inside the function. So when we say num is equal to num plus 1, Python doesn't know what the value of num is. So that is the reason we are getting error here. So it is treating this num and this num as two different variables. This is a global variable while this is a local variable. So what if you want to reference this global variable num inside this function definition? You want to refer to this particular num variable and use it and update the values. So then you can use global keywords, so global, and then you say num. You're saying, you are explicitly telling Python that, hey, this particular num variable is our global variable. So that means this is same as this variable here. So now when you run this code, it will work fine because now this being a global variable, num has a value of 10, 10 plus 1 is 11, and then we are printing 11. And because we are making changes to a global variable, they would reflect throughout the code wherever we are referencing this num variable. So the num variable now has a new value, which is 11. Now, how does the scope works when you have nested functions? A function inside of a function. So here we have our nested functions. We have a function inside of a function. Inner is inside the outer function here. Now we have defined a message variable here. And we also are assigning the value to this message variable from inside this inner function. And then we are going ahead and calling this inner function. So when we call the outer function, what will happen? So this inner function will get called. This block will get executed. It will print inner and then the message. It's printing hi here. The message variable has the value hi. And when we go ahead and print the message outside of this inner function, it prints hello. That means this inner function is creating a new local variable, creating a new local variable. So now let's say that we don't want to create a new local variable, but instead we want to reference the variable message from the outer function. So how can we do that? So for that, we have the non-local keyword. Here explicitly saying that this message variable is not local. So by default, it will then consider this message variable here. And it is going to update the value of this message variable to hi. And now if we run this code, both the inner and the outer function will print hi because the value of this message variable has been updated. So what are we doing here? By using this non-local keyword, we are telling Python that the message variable belongs to the outer function. This message variable belongs to the outer function. So any changes that we do to this variable inside this inner function will affect the message variable from outside as well. So a quick recap of what we have learned today. We have seen what are local variables, what are global variables. Local variables exist only inside their function. Global variables, on the other hand, exist anywhere in the code. Now that you understand scope in Python, try experimenting with it. Try working through different scenarios. Thanks for watching.